The number of Holocaust survivors is dwindling now, but one man was only an adolescent when he was sent to one of those infamous camps. Today, he is a history teacher of sorts, telling area students his horrifying and at the same time life-affirming story.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Judy. My name is Sidney Sevek Finkel, and I'm so happy that you're watching this video. What I want to do is to tell you a story, because that's all I have is just a story. And it's not about the man you see standing before you. It's a story about Sevek, who's a little boy, 8 years old when this whole thing begins. He lives in a country called Poland, in a town called Trybunalski. It's a town of about 60,000 people, so it's a very large-sized town. 20,000 of those people are Jewish. Now, Jewish people have a different set of beliefs, religions, so we kind of live in our own neighborhoods and things like that. And sometimes the relationship between the majority of the people who are Polish Catholic and the Jewish people is not very good. We've lived there for 700 years, and life, especially life for Sevek, is very, very good. What I would like to do now is to tell you about my family. I think that one of the reasons I do this, come to schools and speak to wonderful young people like you, is because when I talk about them and mention their names, it kind of gives me a feeling like they're here with me now, and they want to encourage me to do the best job that I possibly can. I had 3 sisters and a brother. The oldest one in my family was my sister, Ronya, who was 20 years older than I. So she was, of course, a full-grown young woman. She was beautiful, wonderful. I loved her so much. She was always comforting to me. If I had a problem or anything, I could always run to her, and she would make me feel so much better. She got engaged to a very nice young man, and pretty soon there was a big celebration in the house. It was a wedding, and I had a good time. I drank a whole glass of wine. It went right to my head, and they told me that I made a real nuisance of myself. Next was my brother Isaac, who was 17 years older than I, and being a little kid, I absolutely adored my big brother. I thought he was like the greatest thing ever, and I wanted to grow up to be just like him. He was in business with my dad. My dad had a timber yard. And this was like for an 8-year-old Sevek, that was the most exciting thing in the world, because I could play with horses, and I could watch the peasants come in and unload their timber. And it was just really fascinating to be at. We also had a big watchdog, and I loved that dog, but from a distance, because my brother said, "Don't get anywhere near him, he's gonna bite you." But I don't listen. Sevek is the kind of a kid that grew up that he wouldn't listen to other people. I think that maybe helped me kind of survive. And pretty soon I was feeding the dog, and he was lapping at me, and we were just like the best of friends. When the war started, the dog disappeared, and I never saw my dog again. At least I thought of him as being mine, although he wasn't. At that time there was a draft. You had to join the Polish army. And my brother joined the army, and I missed him a lot. But then we had a letter saying that he was coming home on leave. And I was so excited when he walked into the door. I just couldn't get over it, because he had this uniform, soldier's uniform on, and he had a white belt around his waist, and there was an actual dagger that would swing back and forth, and I thought it was like the coolest thing in the world. Next was my sister Lola, who was about 15 years older than I. And I must say that, even though it doesn't sound nice, but I just never liked her. She was always telling me that I wasn't as nice as all the other little boys that she knew. They were very polite and had good manners, and they listened and so forth. And I guess I was a kind of a spoiled kid. I was the youngest one in my family, and the person that spoiled me the most was my dad. The last one in my family was my sister Frania. She was only at that time about 13 years of age, which is the age of you young ladies here. And looking at your faces, I can almost make her out, you know. She had this big saucer black eyes and dark hair, and she was so full of energy and vitality. She just loved life, and she always had girlfriends around her, and they whispered. And I know she was pretty, and I know that the boys agreed that she was pretty, because every time that she was in the house and couldn't come out, these boys would hang around our doorstep, and they would write notes to her. And I would be the one that would carry those notes in, and it made me feel like a real big shot. My younger sister, she was very close to her mother. And my mother was a beautiful woman, and she dressed very nicely, very fashionable. And I just adored my mother. There was a lot of talk about war, and Hitler would come on the radio, and he would make a national speech, and we all would listen to the radio. I didn't understand any German, but I could hear this angry voice coming from the loudspeaker, and every other word was about Juden, about Jews, and how horrible Jews were, and how he was going to really do terrible things to us. And it really frightened us. So when my brother got called into his army unit, we knew that war was inevitable. And sure enough, Germany invaded Poland. They sent the most powerful army in the world. They sent it, and they defeated Poland in just something like 30 days. They sent the Air Force over the skies of Poland, and they bombed my town. They bombed it very severely. And I remember being in the cellar and hearing these high explosions. And I think that was the first time that I really knew what it was like to be really afraid. When we got out of the cellar, there was a lot of damage. And my dad said that we had to get out of this town because it was a bigger town and the planes would come back. We have to go to a little village maybe 10 miles away where we felt we were going to be safe. So on a Sunday morning, it was a beautiful day. We began to walk to that little village called Suleov. And we, of course, were not the only one. All the other people in the town also wanted to get out of danger. So when we got into this little dirt village, the place was absolutely crowded with people. But soon I found some of my friends from school, and we were playing some games. But then all of a sudden I heard these airplane noises coming from the sky. And as I looked up, these great big planes came diving down. And as they dived, they made this horrendous whistling sound. And they dropped insanitary bombs. And everything caught on fire. People were on fire. Animals were on fire. They were all running to and fro. And I was standing there looking up at the sky, and with these big planes left, they had fighter escort planes, and they came down and they flew so low that I felt like I could reach out my hand and touch the plane. I could make out the cockpit and the face of the pilot as he was firing his machine guns at all these poor people. But then I felt my mother grab me by the shoulders and push me down to the ground. And then she did something that whenever I have a bad day or anything, I always think of what my mother did for me then. She fell on top of me and she covered me completely with her body, and that felt really good to be protected like that. But after a while, I could see from the corner of my eyes that my younger sister, Franja, she was crying hysterically. So my mother stood up and she ran into her direction. But, you know, the thing that stays with me the most powerfully is the smell, the stench of burning flesh. It's something that I just cannot eradicate from my mind. When I stood up, I was so frightened. I was all by myself. I didn't know where my mother had gone to, where my father was, or anyone else. I was walking around looking at corpses. But then I heard my name Sevek being called. And my dad and I met each other, and we ran into a nearby forest where we stayed there for 3 days and 3 nights. We were just terrified to come back. When we finally had to go back into that little village, the place was smoldering, and there were big ditches, Well, later on, I learned that over 3,000 people had died that afternoon in that bombardment. My dad was looking for my mother and my younger sister, and someone said that they had gone on a horse-drawn wagon to another part of Poland. And with that, we made our way back to my hometown. And when we got there, the Nazis had already arrived, and from here on, nothing would ever be the same for me or my family. The Nazis were in our hometown only, I think, a couple of weeks. When they came to us where we lived, when we lived in a nice part of town, my dad was a successful businessman. We had a beautiful apartment, and we were told that we had to move. We had 24 hours to get out of it, and we had to move to a segregated area that they called the ghetto. So they took an area which was like the worst part of the town, and maybe like 5,000 people lived there before, and now 20,000, the whole population, had to live in where 5,000 people lived before. We only had 24 hours to get into this ghetto. So we exchanged a 6-7 room apartment for a room and a half. But still, we lived together as a family. We were lucky to have these 1.5 rooms, because a lot of families didn't have any housing at all, and they had to live on the streets, even in the winter time. Everything for us changed completely when we moved into the ghetto. First of all, there was no longer any school. I had stopped my education in 2nd grade. My mother was sewing on a star, the yellow Star of David, on my coat, and I didn't even know what it was. I thought maybe it was some kind of a medal or something I could be proud of, but it had the letter J on it, and it identified me as a Jew. The ghetto was closed in, and you couldn't go outside. Food was very scarce. What was really troubling us the most is what we were seeing further south of us, maybe 100 miles on the railroad line. There were other ghettos larger than ours, and what we're seeing is that the Nazis bring these cattle cars, the freight cars, and the whole population of these ghettos, women, children, young, old, they're all being pushed into these cattle cars. Trains take off, and we don't know where they're going. But the Nazis in our hometown, they tell us we shouldn't be worried, that where these trains is going is going to be a transit camp, a work camp, and the conditions there are going to be good. And they also tell us that our turn is going to come too. But then we hear rumors, we hear terrible rumors. People have escaped from those camps, and they came back, and they tell us like most horrendous, unbelievable story. They tell us that where these trains are going is a place called Treblinka, and that all the people in those trains are quickly moved out, and they put like in thinking that they're going to go take a shower, they put into hermetically sealed huts, and that the gas is introduced into the huts, and these people die. But do you think we believed them? No, we didn't believe them, because, we knew the Germans as being very civilized people, maybe the most civilized people in the world, and that they wouldn't do such a thing. 2,000, now a population of 30,000 Jewish people, 2,000 of us will be able to stay behind, but only those who worked in factories that make goods for the German army. So just think of it. Everybody wanted one of these jobs, because when you had a job, you had this official-looking certificate with a stamp on it, and that could save your life. That could stop you from needing to have to go onto these, what we called by then, those death trains. At this time, my brother, who was in the war, he came back to the ghetto. He was wounded. He had 3 bullets in his right leg, but because he was a wounded soldier, he was given permission to leave the ghetto and go outside to get help for his wounds. And with that, he met some of his Polish friends from before the war. And one of them had a woodworking factory, and my brother begged him to go to the Nazi authorities and get permission for Jews to come and work for him. And he got 20 precious permits. My father got a permit, and my brother got a permit. I did not, because I was not yet 13 years of age. The Germans had the rules. A lot of my friends, smuggled food into the ghetto, and they would be shot on the spot. But yet that they had the rules that you had to be 13 years of age. Now the other problem that my family had is that my loving older sister, Ronya, the one that was married, was now pregnant. And do you know it was against the law to be pregnant? Just the appearance of being pregnant could get you shot. We had a wonderful friend, Polish Catholic friend, the name of Mrs. Novak, and she came into the ghetto and she told us to smuggle her out of the ghetto and put her into a Polish Catholic hospital. So that's what happened. She went into this Polish Catholic hospital as telling them that she was a Catholic. But someone working in that hospital went to the Nazi authorities and they told them there was actually a Jew there. So they came to the hospital and they took the infant, she just had delivered baby boy, and they opened the window and they threw him out. And then they took my sister to the Jewish cemetery where they shot her. My family wouldn't tell me. They didn't want me to be so upset. But one day I met my brother-in-law in the ghetto, and he told me the whole story. And I ran to my house and I crawled underneath the bed, and I just cried and cried and cried. My mother and my father tried to console me, but I wouldn't be consoled. And the strange thing about it, thinking back, is that in the future horrific things were to happen to me, and I wanted desperately to feel tears come down my eyes, but I couldn't cry. I would never really cry again. I would be sad, but I would never be able to cry. No tears would ever be shed by me. As a hourglass, with the sand running out, those trains are coming closer and closer to us. And now they're right there. People went to great lengths to avoid the roundup. Some hid in buildings, and others checked into the hospital, and they underwent unnecessary surgery, hoping that this will be their salvation. These Jews were not spared either. They were taken and shot on the spot. We said our last goodbyes. We now became certain that our fate was sealed. Mother had been preparing food that she put into her rucksack for a journey. Mother talked to me and said, "You must be brave, Sevek, and not make a fuss. You are young, and I want you to promise me that you will not do anything foolish. You do everything you can to survive. You are our future." I wanted to go with my mother no matter what, but had been decided that I would stay with Franja and Isaac. I had no choice. All decisions were made for me regardless of what I wanted. Dad and Isaac had the precious work permits that were issued by the Nazi authorities, and they hoped that they could take me with them to their work. Yet my heart was breaking with longing to be with my mother and sister. When we had to separate from each other, Franja ran up to me and embraced me, kissing my face. "I always loved you, and we'll all meet again soon." And with these words, we parted from the women in our lives, never for me to see my mother or sister again. So imagine this thousands of people assembled in one square, and the Germans, we had their dogs, vicious dogs, and whips, and pushing people into different lines. And I was standing there with my father and my brother, and my father turned to me and he said, "Look, your brother and I are going to stand shoulder to shoulder, and I want you to stand behind us, and we will try and hide you with our bodies." So I stood behind there, but I had to put my finger in my ear because I couldn't bear to hear the screaming of children and shots being fired every few seconds and people's blood and guts coming out. And we waited there for a long time. Finally, a Nazi officer came, and they showed him that they had work permits, and they were going to be okay, but somehow he saw me, and he became very agitated, and he had a whip in his hand, and he was whipping me. But my brother was so brave that he walked up to him, and he talked to him in German, and then he put something in the palm of his hands. And with that, this man smiled and told us to get to our work. So we were the lucky ones who were going to live a while longer. On the other side of the square, and this was told to me by my sister Lola, who survived the war, standing there was Lola and my younger sister Franja and our mother. And they were going to be put onto those trains. But Lola worked for a high German official as a maid, and she saw him and she begged him to come over and take him out of this line that was going to go onto those death trains. And he thought about it, and then he said, well, I'll take you two girls, but I'm not going to take your mother because she's too old and useless. My mother just pushed her away and told her a lie, told her, I'd be better off without you. And so reluctantly and crying all the way, she went with Lola to be in a place that would be safe. But Franja just tore herself away from Lola, and she went looking for mother. I hope she found her, because with that she gave up her life. When this was all over, this deportation was all over, and we left our woodworking factory and went back into a reduced little ghetto, there was nobody that I knew. All my uncles, my cousins, my mother, they were all sent to this gas chamber in Treblinka. The Nazis, although they were losing the war and they were moving out of Russia through Poland back into the homeland, Germany, they would not leave us alone. They took the last 2,000 Jewish slaves and they marched us to a railroad station. And now for the very first time, I'm face to face with one of these cattle cars. I'm separated from my father and brother, and they take me and they push me into this cattle car, and inside it's so smelly and it's cold, it's winter time. There isn't enough place to sit down. We're just packed like sardines. And I think at this point something happens to me. I think that up till then I thought that everything that was going on was like an adventure, like a story about guns and soldiers. But now I realize how serious this was. But I do remember when we arrived into a big German concentration camp called Buchenwald. And we were quickly unloaded with shouts and beating. We had to leave the freight car, and we marched into a building, a processing building, where we were processed there by other prisoners. And they shaved all the hair from my body. And I had my friend Henry was with me. We were together from the ghetto to the work camp, everywhere. And he was like my best friend, and we supported each other in every turn. They put us into a barrack where we slept on tiers. There was 3 tiers, and it would be placed there like sardines. You never knew whose head was on your shoulder or whose feet were in your mouth. And in the morning, there would always be dead bodies. And we just took them and we threw them down, and we stacked them outside like to lumber. We had to stay on roll call every day, and in the wintertime it was freezing, and we would sometimes have to stay there for hours until every prisoner was accounted for. And I was looking, right in front of me, maybe 200 yards away, was these gates of Buchenwald, and I saw the Germans coming in and going out. And I was so much longing to be able to get out, because here I was surrounded by with wire and electrified it with electrified fence, and there were like towers every few hundred yards. It was just closed in like I was a bird in a cage. I had an experience, in Buchenwald that took me, it still bothers me to this day when I met my father. And I want you to read that little page of that. I have an indelible memory of my last meeting with my father. He came across me as I was standing with my friends in the compound. My father cried with joy when he saw me. He hugged me as tears ran down his cheek. He has lost a lot of weight, and he looked very weak and emaciated. He took a piece of bread from his knapsack and he handed it to me. The gesture of the bread showed his great love for me, since these were the only provisions he had for his transport out of Buchenwald. I took the bread, but I felt agitated and uncomfortable. Here standing before me was the one person in the world that I loved more than any other, and yet I was incapable of feeling affection. I bore no resemblance to the son that he knew. Sevek, the fun-loving, affectionate boy's kid, was dead. I now was more like an animal, with instincts only for survival. Likely he was being sent to his death. I'm unsure under what conditions we met, and yet I was silent. I turned my back on my own father without giving him the slightest bit of encouragement or acknowledgement. Who was I? What kind of an animal had I become in the camp? This encounter was so powerful that it stayed with me for the rest of my life. Guilt plagued me and caused me to believe that I had betrayed my father. A couple of years ago, I was invited to come back to Buchenwald for the 66th anniversary of the liberation of the camp. And when I went there with my wife and my son and my daughter, and one day I asked them to just follow me, and I went to the spot where I had last met my father, and I asked my family to stand in a circle and put our arms around our backs, and I prayed out loud to my father. I know that you can feel that here I am with your grandchildren, Leon and Ruth, and I just can see you smiling and embracing and happy you are that I survived, and you have these wonderful great children, and that you live in my spirit, and that I loved you. And I think that helped to heal it. To return to Buchenwald in the war was almost over, and you could hear the guns of the American army, and we were going to be real happy to be liberated, but such was not to be. They took me and Henry and 3,000 other prisoners, and they marched us out of the gate of Buchenwald. We marched into a railroad station, and this was only an 8-mile walk, but people were in such terrible shape that many couldn't make the 8 miles. Like there was a father and son in front of me. The father pushed himself away from the son, and he covered his face with his hands, and he looked upwards and prayed, and he fell on the side of the ditch. And the son was screaming for the father to stand up, and we just saw the guard with a rifle, and we just heard a shot. And we walked to the railroad station, which was about 10 miles away, and waiting for us is, guess what? Another train. Now begins a journey of 3 weeks, And except for the first day when we get a loaf of bread, there's nothing to eat for 3 weeks. And starvation set in. It was just unbelievable. I saw people eating grass, and I thought that would be good. Maybe I can do that. So I took grass and I put it in my tin cup with water, and I tried to drink it, but it wouldn't stay down. Finally, after 3 weeks, from 3,000 prisoners, there was only 1,500 left. The rest were all dead. They were just piled up high in empty freight cars. We came to this town, or this camp called Theresienstadt. And when we got there, we came there on like the happiest day of ever. The day that we dreamt of. It happens when we will be free. And this day had come. The Germans had lost the war. The Nazis have fled the camp, and we were free. They took me to a home, and they fed me very slowly, and I regained my physical strength. And then one day while I'm in that home, I hear my name Sevek being called from the street. So I run to the window, and I look down, and there, behold, is my big brother Isaac. He had walked the streets of this camp shouting my name because he had heard that a bunch of kids had come from Buchenwald. He had a knapsack on his shoulder, and he was able to get some candy and biscuits. It's something I hadn't seen for 5 years. And it was a very, very emotional reunion. It was a very happy day. But the joy didn't stay very long. We realized that my mother was dead, my 2 sisters were dead, my father was gone. And then, I was 13 years of age. There was no education. I was thinking to myself, what's going to become of me? But the British government allowed 1,000 young people under the age of 16 to come to England. And my brother came with us. And when it was in England and they sent me to a boarding school, a very exclusive kind of a boarding school where the kids were so smart. And I didn't know my alphabet. I couldn't tell time on a watch, and I also couldn't get along with the regular kids. I had fights and things like that. I knew how to survive, but I didn't know how to live in a normal life. But the teachers there, they were so fabulous that they wouldn't give up on me. They wouldn't allow me to sink. They loved me until I could love myself. And pretty soon I recovered, and I began to learn. And it was wonderful to be able to read, learn English. Now, I had an uncle in Chicago who came to Chicago from Poland before the war, and when he learned that I had survived, he sent me papers to come to the United States. And the day that the American embassy called me in for my visa, I was the happiest guy. The guy sitting, across the desk from me, he gave me my visa, and I was just jumping up and down because I was so happy that I was coming to America. My life since then, although it was very difficult in the beginning, my last years or so, I've been very, very good. I'm married to the same lady for almost 50 years. We have 5 children. We have 9 grandchildren. One of the biggest things in my life that also happened was that the University of St. Xavier, unbelievably, gave me honorary doctorate degrees. And that's for a person who didn't take his GED test until he was 56 years old. That's something. But most of all, I'm so happy that I have the chance to speak to you, to give you, my story.